The summer heat blazed down on Willow Creek Apartments, making the community pool the most coveted spot in the entire complex. Children laughed and splashed while adults lounged with cool drinks, everyone seeking relief from the scorching temperature that had settled over the city for the past week. Among them was Tanya, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher who had just moved into the complex 2 months ago. After a long week of summer school sessions, she had been looking forward to this moment of peace and relaxation. She had set up her small corner with a colorful beach towel, a paperback mystery novel, and an insulated tumbler filled with iced tea. The pool wasn't particularly crowded for a Saturday. A few families occupied the shallow end, while some teenagers took turns diving in the deep end. Tanya had chosen a quiet spot by the corner, away from the splashing but still close enough to dip her feet in the cool water when she needed. She had been there for about half an hour, alternating between reading her book and occasionally scrolling through her phone, when she noticed a woman staring at her from across the pool. The woman, who appeared to be in her mid-40s with a blonde bob haircut and oversized sunglasses, had been whispering to another woman while repeatedly glancing in Tanya's direction. Tanya tried to ignore it at first. Being one of the few black residents in the predominantly white apartment complex, she had unfortunately grown accustomed to occasional stares. She returned to her book, determined not to let it bother her. This was her home now, and she had every right to enjoy the amenities she paid for. But it wasn't long before she felt a shadow cast over her. Looking up, she found the blonde woman standing over her, arms crossed and lips pursed into a thin line. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying a forced politeness that didn't match her rigid posture. "I don't think I've seen you around here before." Tanya offered a small smile. "I moved in a couple of months ago. Building C." The woman didn't return the smile. Instead, she looked Tanya up and down, making no effort to hide her scrutiny. "Well, I'm Patrice. I'm on the residence committee, and I know most people who live here." "Nice to meet you," Tanya replied, though the interaction was anything but nice. She extended her hand, but Patrice made no move to shake it. "The thing is," Patrice continued, dropping her voice to a stage whisper that several nearby sunbathers could still clearly hear, "this pool is only for residents and their guests. Do you have your resident key card with you?" Tanya felt her chest tighten. This wasn't the first time she'd experienced this particular brand of suspicion, but it never got easier. She took a deep breath before responding. "Yes, I do. I used it to get in through the gate, just like everyone else." She kept her voice steady and calm, despite the anger bubbling underneath. Patrice's eyes narrowed. "Well, I'd like to see it. As a committee member, it's my responsibility to ensure only residents are using our facilities. We've had problems with people from the neighboring apartments sneaking in, you know." By now, several people had turned to watch the interaction. An uncomfortable silence fell over their corner of the pool as children sensed the tension and parents pulled them closer. "I don't think you've asked anyone else here to show their key card," Tanya observed, glancing around the pool where at least 15 other people were enjoying their Saturday without interruption. "Because I know everyone else here," Patrice insisted, her voice rising slightly. "Now, if you're really a resident, you shouldn't have a problem showing me your card." Tanya had two choices: she could show her card and end the confrontation, or she could stand her ground on principle. For a brief moment, she considered the easier path: just show the card, let this woman have her little power trip, and return to her book. But then she thought about the message that would send. She thought about how this same scene played out countless times in pools, parks, coffee shops, and neighborhoods across the country. She thought about how tired she was of having to prove she belonged in spaces where she had every right to be. "Actually, I do have a problem with that," Tanya said, closing her book and sitting up straighter. "I don't see you asking anyone else for their proof of residency. I used my key card to enter this gate, just like everyone else did." Patrice's face flushed red. "Listen, I'm just trying to do my job and protect our community." "Your job?" Tanya raised an eyebrow. Are you employed by the management company? Because I'd be happy to speak with them directly. A few murmurs rippled through the onlookers. An older gentleman sitting nearby cleared his throat. Patrice, leave the lady alone. She's my new neighbor from Building C. She's lived here for months now. Patrice turned toward the man, momentarily thrown off balance. Well, Randy, you should have said something sooner. I shouldn't have had to, Randy replied, shaking his head. You don't ask anybody else for their ID, and you know it. Another woman spoke up from a few chairs down. Yeah, Patrice, you didn't ask me for my card when I moved in last month. Patrice's face grew redder, but she wasn't backing down. Well, that's different. How exactly is it different? Tanya asked, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. She stood up now, facing Patrice eye to eye. I'm just trying to keep this community safe, Patrice insisted, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. No, Tanya said firmly. You're making assumptions about who belongs here based on how they look. And that's not just wrong, it's exhausting for people who have to constantly prove they have a right to exist in spaces where they live, work, and play. More residents were watching now, and Tanya could feel her phone buzzing in her bag, probably work emails, but they would have to wait. This moment was too important. I'm not going to show you my key card, Tanya continued. But I'll tell you what I will do. Tomorrow, I'll be stopping by the management office to file a formal complaint about this harassment, and I'll be bringing witnesses. Patrice looked around, suddenly aware that the tide of public opinion had turned against her. Several residents were nodding in agreement with Tanya, while others looked away uncomfortably, unwilling to get involved but clearly not supporting Patrice's actions either. This is ridiculous, Patrice sputtered. I was just trying to help. No, came another voice from across the pool. A middle-aged man had stood up. You were profiling her, and we all watched you do it. My family and I have been coming to this pool for 3 years, and I've never once seen you ask anyone white to prove they live here. Patrice stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The poolside had fallen completely silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the edges. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their playful splashing paused as they watched the adults with curious eyes. I never, Patrice stammered, her confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. You people always make everything about race. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Tanya felt her heart pound, but she remained composed, years of managing classroom conflicts helping her maintain her cool. What do you mean by, you people? She asked quietly. Before Patrice could respond, the pool gate swung open and a tall man in khaki shorts and a polo shirt with the apartment complex logo entered. It was Mr. Howard, the property manager, his usual cheerful face now etched with concern. I got 3 calls about a disturbance at the pool, he said, looking around until his eyes settled on the standoff between Tanya and Patrice. What's happening here? Several people started speaking at once. Randy, the older gentleman who had spoken up for Tanya earlier, raised his hand like he was in a classroom, and surprisingly, everyone quieted down. If I may, he said, his voice carrying the weight of his 70-plus years. Ms. Patrice here took it upon herself to question this young lady's right to be at the pool. Asked for her key card and everything, hasn't done that to anyone else all summer. Mr. Howard's expression darkened as he turned to Patrice. Is this true, Ms. Reynolds? Patrice's face flushed deeper. I was just doing my duty as a committee member. We've had problems with outsiders using the facilities. By outsiders, do you mean people who look like me? Tanya asked. She was tired of having this same conversation, tired of being the one who had to be calm and reasonable while others let their biases show. Mr. Howard held up a hand. Ms. Reynolds, we've discussed this before. The resident committee is for organizing community events and bringing concerns to management. It does not give anyone authority to police the facilities or demand identification from residents. But. No buts, Mr. Howard cut her off firmly. This is exactly the kind of situation I warned about in our last meeting. He turned to Tanya with an apologetic look. Ma'am, I'm very sorry about this. I remember processing your lease paperwork myself a couple months back. Building C, Unit 305, correct? Tanya nodded, a small sense of vindication washing over her. C? Patrice interjected desperately. I was right to check. How was I supposed to know? You weren't supposed to check anyone, Mr. Howard replied, his patience visibly wearing thin. That's not your job or you're right. A woman sitting nearby with 2 young children stood up. Patrice, just last week my sister was visiting with her kids, and you were chatting with them right here at the pool. Never once asked if they lived here. That's different, Patrice insisted. How? Several voices asked simultaneously. Patrice looked around, suddenly realizing she had no allies in this fight. Her shoulders slumped slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. Mr. Howard turned back to Tanya. Would you be willing to come to my office tomorrow to discuss this incident? I take these matters very seriously. Tanya nodded. I'll be there. As for you, Ms. Reynolds, Mr. Howard continued, turning back to Patrice, I'll need to see you in my office first thing tomorrow morning as well. We need to discuss your role on the resident committee moving forward. Patrice's eyes widened. You can't remove me from the committee. I've been chairperson for 3 years. All the more reason you should have known better, Mr. Howard replied firmly. This isn't the first complaint we've received. A few knowing glances were exchanged among the residents, suggesting this wasn't the first time Patrice had overstepped her bounds. Sensing she was fighting a losing battle, Patrice gathered her belongings with short, angry movements. This is ridiculous. I was just trying to protect our community. Our community includes everyone who lives here, Mr. Howard stated. Everyone deserves to feel welcome and safe, not interrogated. As Patrice stormed off, slamming the pool gate behind her, Tanya felt a mix of emotions washing over her. Relief that the confrontation was over, pride that she had stood her ground, gratitude for the neighbors and property manager who had supported her, but also a deep weariness that such incidents were still so common. Randy, the older gentleman, moved his chair closer to Tanya's spot. I'm sorry that happened to you, he said quietly. Been living here 15 years, and we've had a few Patrices come and go. Thank you for speaking up, Tanya replied. It means a lot. Shouldn't have had to, he said, shaking his head. But times are changing, slow as molasses sometimes, but they're changing. Around the pool, the atmosphere gradually returned to normal. Children resumed their splashing, adults returned to their conversations, though many came by Tanya's chair to introduce themselves properly, as if making up for Patrice's behavior with their own small gestures of welcome. Mr. Howard lingered for a moment. Again, I'm truly sorry about this. This isn't what our community stands for. I appreciate that, Tanya said. But actions speak louder than words. I'll be interested to see what happens next. The next morning arrived with a sky full of clouds that promised rain later in the day. Tanya woke up earlier than usual, her mind replaying yesterday's events at the pool. After getting ready and having a quick breakfast, she headed to the leasing office for her 9:30 appointment with Mr. Howard. As she approached the office, she spotted Patrice leaving, her face tight with anger. They locked eyes briefly, but Patrice quickly looked away and hurried to her car without a word. Tanya took a deep breath and pushed open the glass door to the office. Mr. Howard greeted her with a professional smile and ushered her into his private office. Thank you for coming in, Ms. Johnson. Can I get you some coffee or water? Water would be nice, thank you, Tanya replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. Once they were both seated, Mr. Howard's expression grew more serious. "First, I want to apologize again for what happened yesterday. It was unacceptable." "I appreciate that," Tanya said. "But I'm more interested in what you're going to do about it. This isn't just about me, it's about making sure all residents feel welcome here." Mr. Howard nodded. "You're absolutely right. I've just finished speaking with Ms. Reynolds. She's been removed from the resident committee, effective immediately." Tanya raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised by the swift action. Reading her expression, Mr. Howard continued, "This isn't the first complaint we've received about her behavior. We've had 3 similar incidents in the past year alone, though none quite as public as yesterday's. And yet she remained on the committee until now?" Tanya couldn't help asking. Mr. Howard had the grace to look embarrassed. Previous complaints were handled with warnings because they were reported after the fact with no witnesses. Yesterday was different, too many people saw it happen. Tanya nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken message. It wasn't that they hadn't believed the previous complaints, they just hadn't felt they could act on them. Beyond addressing Ms. Reynolds specifically, Mr. Howard continued, "We're implementing some changes. Next week, we're holding a mandatory training for all committee members about community guidelines and inclusivity. We're also adding clearer language to our community rules about harassment." He slid a document across the desk toward her. "This is a formal apology from management, along with 3 months of complimentary covered parking as a small gesture of goodwill." Tanya glanced at the paper but didn't pick it up. "Mr. Howard, I don't need free parking. What I need is to know that this community truly welcomes everyone who lives here." "What would you suggest?" he asked, seeming genuinely interested. Tanya thought for a moment. "The community events I've seen advertised don't reflect much cultural diversity. Maybe the new committee could work on changing that?" Mr. Howard nodded, jotting down notes. "That's an excellent suggestion. Would you consider joining the resident committee yourself? We could use your perspective." The question caught Tanya off guard. She hadn't expected to be invited into the very group that had caused her trouble. But then again, perhaps that was exactly where change needed to start. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Send me the information for the next meeting." As she left the office, the sky opened up and rain began to fall. Tanya stood under the awning for a moment, watching the drops create ripples in the puddles forming on the pavement. Sometimes, she thought, it takes a storm to clear the air. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at the pool. Tanya had mostly kept to herself, focusing on her summer school classes and preparing for the regular school year that would start in just a month. She hadn't returned to the pool yet, not out of fear but simply because she hadn't felt ready to revisit that space. On Wednesday evening, while Tanya was grading papers at her kitchen table, there was a knock at her door. Through the peephole, she saw Randy, the older gentleman who had spoken up for her at the pool. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," he said when she opened the door. "Just wanted to drop this off." He handed her a flyer for a community potluck scheduled for that Saturday. "The committee is trying something new," he explained. "Instead of the usual burgers and hot dogs, they're asking everyone to bring a dish that represents their heritage or family tradition. Thought you might want to know." Tanya looked at the colorful flyer with interest. "Are you on the committee now, Randy?" "Me? Heavens no," he chuckled. "Too old for that business. But my granddaughter is. She moved in with me last month. She's the one who called Mr. Howard that day at the pool. Please thank her for me," Tanya said sincerely. Randy nodded. "She said you haven't been to any committee meetings yet, even though Mr. Howard keeps sending you invitations." Tanya sighed. "I've been busy with work, and honestly, I'm not sure if I want to take that on right now." "Understandable," Randy said. "No pressure. But sometimes the best way to change things is from the inside. He tapped the flyer in her hand. Think about the potluck, at least. Would be good for people to see you're still part of this community. After Randy left, Tanya sat back at her kitchen table, staring at the flyer. The old man had a point. Avoiding community spaces was letting Patrice's actions continue to affect her life, even if indirectly. Saturday arrived with perfect weather for an outdoor gathering. Tanya decided to attend, bringing her grandmother's famous sweet potato pie, a recipe that had been passed down through generations and had won her family bragging rights at church functions for decades. She arrived at the community center a little after the official start time, carrying her pie in a special carrier. The room was already buzzing with conversation and laughter. Tables lined the walls, laden with dishes from around the world, their handwritten labels indicating origins from Ethiopia to El Salvador, Poland to the Philippines. Tanya placed her pie on the dessert table, carefully writing "Southern Sweet Potato Pie" on the provided label. As she straightened up, she noticed several familiar faces from the pool that day, including the woman who had mentioned Patrice not questioning her white sister. "You made it," the woman said, approaching with a warm smile. "I'm Diane. We didn't properly meet that day. That's my husband Tom and our kids over there." She pointed to a man helping two young children balance plates of food. "I love your earrings," Diane continued, gesturing to Tanya's colorful geometric earrings. "Thanks, I make them myself," Tanya replied, surprised by the genuine friendliness. "Really? That's amazing. Several of us do a craft night on Thursdays. You should join us sometime." As more residents introduced themselves, Tanya felt some of her hesitation melting away. These weren't just polite interactions, people seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. When she finally reached the food tables to fill her own plate, she was stopped by a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s. "You're Tanya, right? I'm Zoe, Randy's granddaughter. I'm so glad you came. It's nice to finally meet you," Tanya said, shaking Zoe's hand. The young woman had bright eyes and an earnest smile that reminded Tanya of her own students. "I've been hoping you'd come to one of our meetings," Zoe said. "We're trying to make real changes around here, but we need more diverse voices." Tanya nodded, understanding the weight of that request. "Your grandfather mentioned you're on the committee now?" "Yes, they had some unexpected openings," Zoe said with a hint of mischief in her voice. "I'm the youngest member by about 20 years, but they're actually listening to my ideas." As they filled their plates, Zoe explained how the committee had been restructured since Patrice's removal. The potluck was their first event under new leadership, with more plans in the works. "We're organizing a cultural exchange night next month," Zoe explained. "People can share music, art, stories, whatever represents their background. We're also updating the pool rules to explicitly state that harassment won't be tolerated." They found seats at a table where Randy was already holding court with a group of residents, sharing stories about how the neighborhood had changed over the decades he'd lived there. "When I first moved here in the 80s, he was saying, this place had a different feel. Not always welcoming to everyone, if you know what I mean." He noticed Tanya and Zoe joining them and smiled. "But look at us now, better late than never." Throughout the evening, Tanya noticed something she hadn't expected: genuine connections forming. People weren't just making awkward small talk, they were exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet up, and discovering shared interests across cultural lines. As she was helping with cleanup, Mr. Howard approached her. "Your pie was a hit, there's not a crumb left." "My grandmother would be proud," Tanya replied with a smile. "I wanted to let you know," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "that Ms. Reynolds has put her condo up for sale. She's moving to her sister's neighborhood across town." Tanya took in this information with mixed feelings. "I never wanted to drive anyone away." "You didn't," Mr. Howard assured her. "She made her own choices. But I thought you should know that our actions after the incident sent a clear message about what kind of community we want to be. As the evening wound down, Tanya found herself exchanging contacts with several neighbors, including Diane and her craft group. She even tentatively agreed to attend the next committee meeting, though she made no promises about joining. Walking back to her apartment under the soft glow of the complex's pathway lights, Tanya reflected on how differently things had turned out than she might have expected. The confrontation at the pool had been painful, but it had also catalyzed changes that might not have happened otherwise. Her phone buzzed with a text from Zoe, "Thanks for coming tonight. The committee meets Tuesday at 7. No pressure, but we saved you a seat." Smiling face with smiling eyes. Tanya smiled at the message. She hadn't intended to become a community activist when she moved here, she just wanted a nice place to live. But sometimes standing your ground opened doors you hadn't even known were there. As she reached her building, she paused to look back at the community center, still lit up with the last few residents chatting in the parking lot. For the first time since moving in, Willow Creek Apartments felt like it might actually become home. Tuesday evening arrived faster than Tanya expected. She stood in front of her closet, debating whether she should actually attend the committee meeting. Part of her was curious about what changes they were implementing, while another part worried about becoming the token diversity member, expected to speak for all Black residents. After changing her mind 3 times, she finally grabbed her keys and headed out. Just observing, she reminded herself. No commitment. The community room was set up differently than it had been for the potluck. Chairs were arranged in a circle rather than the traditional rows facing a head table that Tanya had expected. About a dozen people were already there when she arrived, including Randy, Zoe, and several faces she recognized from the pool incident and the potluck. "Tanya! You made it!" Zoe waved enthusiastically, patting an empty chair beside her. As Tanya took her seat, she noticed a young Latino man she hadn't met before introducing himself to another new attendee. The atmosphere felt different from any committee meeting she'd ever attended, more casual, more welcoming. "We're trying a new format," Zoe explained, noticing Tanya's surprise at the setup. "Less formal, more collaborative. Our first act after the restructuring was to throw out Robert's Rules of Order." The meeting began with each person sharing their name and how long they'd lived in the complex. When it was Tanya's turn, she kept it simple. "I'm Tanya, Building C. I've been here about 3 months." Several people smiled in recognition, but no one mentioned the pool incident directly, which Tanya appreciated. The committee chair, a middle-aged woman named Grace who Tanya learned was a retired social worker, guided the discussion through several agenda items. They reviewed the success of the potluck, discussed plans for the cultural exchange night, and addressed some maintenance concerns around the property. "Now for our main discussion topic tonight," Grace said. "Creating a more welcoming community environment. We've drafted some proposed additions to our community guidelines, and we'd like everyone's input." Zoe distributed copies of a document titled Willow Creek Community Values Statement. Tanya read through it with growing interest. The language was straightforward but meaningful, emphasizing respect, inclusion, and the shared responsibility of all residents to create a welcoming environment. When the discussion opened, Tanya found herself speaking up. "I like that this focuses on positive values rather than just rules about what not to do." Several heads nodded in agreement. "I was wondering," Tanya continued, surprising herself with her willingness to engage, "if we might consider adding something about celebrating the diversity of our community as a strength." "That's an excellent suggestion," Grace said, making a note. "Would you be willing to draft some language for that section?" Before Tanya could respond, Randy spoke up. "I'd also like to see something about how longtime residents should welcome newcomers. The old-timers like me need to remember what it feels like to be new." The discussion flowed naturally, with various residents building on each other's ideas. Tanya found herself fully engaged, offering suggestions and considering different perspectives. It was a far cry from the tense atmosphere at the pool that day. As the meeting wrapped up, Grace announced, our next agenda item is planning the back-to-school ice cream social. We need a couple of volunteers to lead that effort. Without fully thinking it through, Tanya raised her hand. I could help with that. I'm a teacher, so I have some experience with school events. Zoe beamed beside her. I'll co-lead with Tanya. As they left the meeting, Randy gave Tanya a knowing smile. Just observing, huh? Tanya laughed. Apparently I'm not very good at staying on the sidelines. Over the next 2 weeks, Tanya found herself increasingly involved in community activities. Planning the ice cream social with Zoe turned out to be fun rather than a chore. They met at the complex's cafe twice to finalize details, their planning sessions often stretching into hours of conversation as they discovered shared interests in travel, books, and education. Zoe was studying to become a teacher herself. The back-to-school ice cream social was scheduled for the Saturday before school started. As the day approached, Tanya realized she still hadn't returned to the pool since the incident. With summer winding down and temperatures still soaring, she decided it was time to reclaim that space. Early Friday evening, when most residents would be preparing dinner or commuting home from work, Tanya packed her beach bag and headed to the pool. As she'd hoped, it was nearly empty, just a couple of teenagers in the deep end and a mother with a toddler in the shallow area. Tanya found a chair in her usual corner, spread out her towel, and took a deep breath. The familiar sounds of splashing water and the smell of chlorine brought back memories of that confrontation, but they felt more distant now, less sharp around the edges. She had just settled in with her book when a shadow fell across her chair. Looking up, Tanya froze. It was Patrice. I thought you were moving, Tanya said, immediately regretting how defensive it sounded. Patrice looked different, subdued, less rigid in her posture. The condo closes next week. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I saw you from my balcony and thought, well, I should probably say something before I leave. Tanya said nothing, waiting. I've been doing some thinking, Patrice said, looking at the ground rather than at Tanya. My daughter sent me some articles after she heard what happened. She was not happy with me. Tanya raised an eyebrow but remained silent. Anyway, Patrice continued, I still don't think I was completely wrong to be concerned about pool security, but I was wrong about other things. She fumbled with the words. I didn't treat you the way I would have treated someone who looked different. Someone who looked like me. It wasn't the most eloquent apology, but Tanya sensed it was genuine. Thank you for saying that. Patrice nodded stiffly. My daughter says I have work to do. She's probably right. She glanced around the pool area. I hear the potluck was nice. It was, Tanya confirmed. Your recipe for lemon bars was missed, though. Diane mentioned you usually bring them. Surprise flickered across Patrice's face. She said that? People can disagree with your actions without demonizing you completely, Tanya said gently. That's something I try to teach my students. Patrice seemed to absorb this. Well, I should let you enjoy your evening. She turned to leave, then hesitated. For what it's worth, I think you'll be good for this community. Better than I was. As Patrice walked away, Tanya returned to her book, but found herself unable to focus on the words. The interaction had been unexpected, imperfect, but somehow important. Later, as the sun began to set and the pool lights came on, casting a blue glow across the water, Tanya finally slipped into the pool. The cool water enveloped her, washing away the last of the tension she'd been carrying. This space belonged to her too, just as much as it belonged to anyone else who lived here. When she finally gathered her things to leave, she realized she felt different, lighter somehow. Not because of Patrice's awkward apology, but because she had reclaimed something that was rightfully hers all along. Saturday afternoon arrived with perfect weather for the back-to-school ice cream social. Tanya and Zoe had transformed the community center with colorful decorations, setting up stations for different ice cream flavors and toppings. A playlist of family-friendly music played through speakers, and outdoor games were arranged on the lawn for the kids. "You really went all out," Mr. Howard commented as he helped set up the final touches. "This is the most organized event we've had in years." Tanya smiled. "Once a teacher, always a teacher. Organization is my superpower." By 4 o'clock, residents began arriving, families with children of all ages, older couples without kids who simply enjoyed ice cream, and single residents drawn by the community spirit. Tanya found herself naturally taking on a host role, welcoming newcomers and making introductions. "Ms. Johnson? Is that you?" A small voice broke through the crowd. Tanya turned to see one of her students from the previous year, 8-year-old Lily, racing toward her with excitement. "Lily. I didn't know you lived in Willow Creek," Tanya said, delighted by the surprise. "We just moved in last month," Lily's mother explained, joining them. "Building D. We had no idea you lived here too until Lily saw the flyer with your name on it. This is perfect timing. Lily will be in my friend Mrs. Chen's class this year. She's wonderful," Tanya assured them. "Let me introduce you to some other families with kids your age." Throughout the afternoon, Tanya was struck by how different this gathering felt from any previous community event she'd attended. Children from various backgrounds played together on the lawn while parents chatted across differences that might have previously kept them in separate circles. Randy held court at one of the tables, entertaining kids with magic tricks he'd apparently been practicing for the occasion. Diane from the craft group approached with a small gift bag. "A little welcome present," she explained. "Just some crafting supplies. We meet on Thursdays if you're still interested." Zoe joined them, carrying a clipboard. "The feedback forms are all positive," she reported. "And 3 more people signed up for the committee. We're going to need a bigger meeting room." As the event began winding down, Tanya found a moment to slip away to the edge of the gathering and take it all in. Just 2 months ago, she had been the newcomer, uncertain of her place, then challenged when trying to use a space she had every right to enjoy. Now she was helping shape this community into something better. "Penny for your thoughts?" Randy appeared beside her, offering a cup of water. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Tanya admitted. "When I moved in, I just wanted a nice, quiet place to live. I wasn't looking to join committees or organize events." "Life rarely goes according to plan," Randy observed. "Sometimes the detours take us exactly where we need to be." They watched as Zoe directed the cleanup crew with cheerful efficiency, assigning tasks and thanking volunteers. "Your granddaughter is quite something," Tanya said. Randy nodded proudly. "She reminds me of my late wife. Never afraid to speak up, always working to make things better." He glanced sideways at Tanya. "Reminds me of you, too." Tanya smiled at the unexpected compliment. "I'm just doing what feels right." "That's all any of us can do," Randy said. "And sometimes, that's enough to change things." As the last residents drifted away and the cleanup neared completion, Tanya checked her phone to find several text messages from neighbors expressing thanks and suggestions for future events. She'd gone from being an outsider to a central figure in the community, all because she'd refused to be pushed aside that day at the pool. 1 month after the ice cream social, on the final warm weekend of early autumn, Willow Creek Apartments held its first cultural exchange night. The community center was packed with residents sharing aspects of their heritage through food, music, art, and stories. Display tables lined the walls, featuring everything from handmade crafts to family photos to traditional clothing. Tanya had set up a small table displaying items from her family's history, her grandmother's handwritten recipe cards, a quilt made by her great-grandmother, and photos showing 5 generations of her family. She'd been nervous about sharing these personal pieces of herself, but the genuine interest from her neighbors had quickly put her at ease. "This is incredible," said Grace, the committee chair, surveying the bustling room. "When we first proposed this event, I wasn't sure people would participate." "Sometimes people just need an invitation and a little encouragement," Tanya replied, thinking about her own journey from reluctant resident to active community member. As the evening progressed, Tanya mingled through the crowd, learning about traditions from a dozen different cultures represented within their small community. She sampled home-cooked dishes with recipes passed down through generations, listened to folk tales from around the world, and even learned a few dance steps from an elderly couple who had once been professional dancers in their native country. Near the refreshment table, she spotted Mr. Howard deep in conversation with a group of residents she recognized from committee meetings. He caught her eye and waved her over. "Tanya, perfect timing. We were just discussing plans for next year's community events calendar," he explained. "Everyone agrees the changes over the past few months have been wonderful for Willow Creek." "It's been a team effort," Tanya said modestly. "But it started with you," said a voice behind her. Tanya turned to see Randy and Zoe. "If you hadn't stood your ground that day at the pool, who knows if any of this would have happened?" Tanya shook her head. "I just wanted to use the pool in peace. You all did the real work changing things." "Sometimes it takes one person to start the ripple," Zoe said. "That was you." As the evening wound down, Tanya found herself standing by the windows overlooking the pool area, illuminated by soft lights in the growing dusk. The space that had once been the site of such tension now seemed peaceful, almost symbolic of the transformation that had taken place throughout the community. "Thinking about going for a swim?" Randy asked, joining her at the window. "Maybe tomorrow," Tanya smiled. "It looks like a perfect day for it." "You know," Randy said thoughtfully, "my wife used to say that communities are like gardens, they only thrive when people care enough to tend them." Tanya nodded. She was right. "She would have liked you," Randy added. "She never had much patience for people like Patrice either." They shared a knowing smile as announcements called everyone's attention to the front of the room. Grace was standing on a chair with a microphone. "Before we wrap up tonight, I want to thank everyone who made this event possible," she began. "Especially our newest committee members who brought fresh energy and ideas." As Grace continued acknowledging volunteers, Tanya felt a deep sense of belonging wash over her. The confrontation at the pool had been uncomfortable, even painful, but it had ultimately led to something beautiful, a community where differences were not just tolerated but celebrated, where standing up for what was right had created space for everyone to belong. When she'd moved to Willow Creek Apartments, Tanya had been looking for a place to live. Unexpectedly, she had found something more valuable, a place to belong, a community to shape, and a home in the truest sense of the word.